This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing, by Rebecca Vilkemerson and Rabbi Alyssa Wise. What does the politics of solidarity look like in practice, and how can left-wing organizations grow in numbers and power while remaining accountable to broader movements of which they are a part? In this book, two key leaders of Jewish Voice for Peace focus on the important role of anti-Zionist Jewish organizing within the broader Palestine solidarity movement, reflecting their decade of leadership and drawing lessons about building organizations and fighting for justice as our movements evolve over time. Find Solidarity is the Political Version of Love at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The de-alignment of working-class voters away from the Democratic Party toward either full-scale alienation or to the MAGA far right has become a multiracial phenomenon. This should be devastating news for the stewards of the Democratic Party. But instead, many in their leadership are doing everything possible to avoid learning anything from this defeat. Here at The Dig, however, we're going to try to learn everything we can from this election so that we on the left can figure out what we need to do to move forward, build power, defeat the far right, and win. That conversation starts today with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. I'll be continuing this analysis with others in the coming months, including Richard Seymour, the author of the new book, Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization. I really think understanding how nationalism, a nationalism that's certainly racist, but not merely racism, as liberals and even some leftists like to reductively construe it, I think this nationalism is really at the core of the dangerous, multiracial far right that Trump is building. Before we get started, we're dedicated to political education at The Dig, which is why we paywall nothing. The reason we can afford to do that is because listeners like you support us at patreon.com/thedig. Every supporter gets our newsletter in their email inbox. We also have gifts to send you in the mail. But the basic pitch is that we are supported by listeners who think that the work we do is important. If that's you, contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, the co-founder of Hammer and Hope, a digital magazine of race, culture, and politics. She's the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation and a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, welcome back to The Dig.
Thank you. Great to be here. Sort of.
Yeah. Caveat, asterisk. I'm thinking back a lot to 2016 when the big story was white working class voters shifting hard to Trump. And we can, I think, all really clearly remember the elite liberal refrain that these uneducated white people were just racists, plain and simple, and that was the sort of explanation for Trumpism. And racism, of course, played a role. It always plays a role here in the United States of America. That's not novel. But today, after 2020 and then Harris's loss this week, it's really abundantly clear that this class de-alignment from the Democratic Party is a multiracial phenomenon. What's your diagnosis? What's driving this class de-alignment, and why does the Democratic Party seem totally incapable of confronting it?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, I think, is important to say because there's still pockets. It's been less pronounced than 2016, but there's still pockets of people who are going on about white women and, white people did this. And, I think that it's really important to kind of unpack what happened and who voted and what this is about. Trump's support among white people in general has gone down. The problem is that the bottom of the Democratic Party literally fell out. And so I wrote in my magazine, Hammer and Hope, that the biggest problem for the Democratic Party was not necessarily the defection of Black men to Trump, although I'll come back to that, but was the indifference to the election itself, meaning that Trump wasn't the biggest competition, it was the couch. Were people motivated enough to get up and go and deal with, all of the nonsense of what it has become to vote in this country? And so I don't know exactly who voted in 2020 and didn't vote in 2024. There's still a lot of parsing through the exit data to get the full picture. Now, saying that, it is important to talk about the defections where they happened among Latino men and Black men in particular. One of the things that has been missing from the discussion about the Democratic Party's campaign over the last few months is the way that the party was systematically missing the extent to which people are in crisis in the U.S. And this is, the heart of Joe Biden's insistence that he remain in the race was that he had turned the economy around. And by all conventional measures, the American economy was doing well. Unemployment, historically low. Poverty, low. For African Americans, poverty, the rate at which people are living in poverty is at historic lows. Biden was correct that the rate of inflation had precipitously declined. I think it's at around 2.1 now. Problem, falling rates of inflation are not falling prices. It just means the rate at which prices are rising has slowed down. And so we are still stuck with whether it's price gouging, whether it's inflation, whatever it is, the resting place of these prices are really out of whack with what people's incomes are, especially when you take into consideration that the nest eggs that people had amassed through the COVID payments, whether it was enhanced unemployment, whether it was the stimulus checks, whatever it was, being at home, not having to pay for gas, rent moratorium, people were able to store away money. That money's gone. That money's gone. Savings over the summer began to dip as low as they had in the recession of 2008. And so the Democratic Party seemed to have no consciousness of this. And so how does this economic picture play out in real life? Well, 2023 to 2024, a historic rise in homelessness that is on schedule to rise even higher this year, at the end of this year, 2024. Food insecurity, high. All of these kinds of barometers by which people measure the quality of their life pointed downward for working class people. Rent today is 20% higher than it was in 2020. There was a study on consumer debt that showed in the first quarter of this year, 2024, consumer debt had exceeded $17 trillion. So to the extent that people are holding their lives together, it's through credit cards, which, of course, we know is completely unsustainable. And so you can go through the statistics, you can go through all of these kinds of measurements that we can piece together what a working class person's life is like. And you contrast this to the platform and the promises, policies, whatever, that the Democratic Party has had on offer since their convention moving forward. And it's like they're living in a different universe. I mean, take yourself back to the DNC, to the Democratic National Convention, where the theme was joy. And not only was joy perverse in the midst of a genocide in Gaza, but even on the terms of what it means for American workers, the theme of joy is just not appropriate when people are facing homelessness, when people are facing housing insecurity, food insecurity, so on and so forth. And so there has been a kind of, I won't give them the benefit of saying that there's a kind of strategic fumble, because I think these are the politics of the Democratic Party, which is a hostility to an expansion of the welfare state, a hostility to the COVID welfare state that was quickly assembled and then just as quickly disassembled. But what it did was show ordinary people that actually it is possible to use the government to improve people's lives overnight. Like, you can literally do this overnight. And so I think that the Democratic Party, which paints itself as the party of working class people, the party of ordinary people, have not had a message to communicate that, because I just think it is not a part of their bag. I think there's maybe an emotional resonance that this is what our history is. But when you look at what is actually on offer compared to what individuals are dealing with, there is a mismatch. And I think that the chickens have come home to roost with that. And we've seen the dramatic fallout. To lose the presidency, the Senate, most likely the House, is a dramatic condemnation of the Democratic Party strategy.
Yeah, I think we can't overstate the centrality of the housing crisis amid the larger cost of living crisis, amid a half-century long process of neoliberal economic restructuring, which has had a dramatic political impact, which I think even the Biden administration started to realize in some ways in terms of thinking through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, rebuilding the labor movement. This will rebuild the base that the Democratic Party needs to win, and that had been eviscerated under the Obama and Clinton administrations. And yet, even though Biden in these certain ways departed from neoliberal orthodoxy, he was still so constrained by neoliberal orthodoxy, and that amidst a cost of living crisis, he could not consider price controls
Nixonian.
Once very normal in the United States. They were off the table. We didn't see any. We saw zero concerted effort from the White House down from mainstream Democrats to deal with the housing crisis by pursuing rent control. And as you just pointed out, all of this on the heels of Americans during the pandemic getting this glimpse of what a modest social democracy might look like. Oh, damn, the government can just give me things that
And it was extremely popular.
And then they took it away.
Well, I think it's important to point out that in 2020, because there were 26 million people marching in the streets, exerting unprecedented pressure on the Democratic Party, that Joe Biden was forced to go from having said in the fall of 2019 at the beginning of the primary season, telling donors that not much would change if I were to become president, to him having to change everything during the course of that election to try to transform activism in the streets into votes for him. And in doing so, the Democratic Party made big promises. And I think it's worth, we can go through the platform, the Democratic Party platform that was turned over to activists to basically rewrite in the summer of 2020. The promises to cancel student debt, to pay for family leave, to invest money in childcare, on and on and on. And what happened?
Opposing regime change in Iran.
Yes.
That went out the window.
and what happened in the midst of all these promises? They won more votes than in any other presidential election in American history. So to go from that to conclude with Kamala Harris that we need to run away from that that we need to dump all of that is absurd and really politically insane. The Biden administration, then in an effort to rescue the economy that had been sidelined because of COVID and the demands that people stay at home, also had to enact these dramatic reforms with the American Rescue Plan that was really effective. And again, demonstrated to people that this kind of government investment to make people's lives better is good, is popular. And even if you look today at polls that Pew did a bunch of polls about investment in government, is it for the good? Is it for the worse because we might go into debt? Consistently, large majorities support government involvement in healthcare, government use of resources to mitigate poverty, government resources to ensure that people have housing, government resources to ensure that people have childcare. People want investments in their schools. So it's not like this developing narrative now that, Americans are just right wing and Trump gives them what they want. And, what do they want? They just want to be angry and lash out. It's actually not that people want reform. And the Democratic Party runs away from reform and have spent the better part of 2 generations trying to disconnect themselves from the legacy of an earlier era of reform. And so they don't actually champion these policies. They champion, horrible kind of public-private partnership programs that mimic what, real reform would look like. But they don't want to be seen as a party pushing for the resumption of any kind of welfare state. So it means that they're a party with a muddled message, whether it's Joe Biden and searching for the soul of America or whatever the hell he described it as in 2020, or Kamala Harris, and we're the party of joy and freedom, whatever that means, in a time of extreme political and economic crisis.
And we saw support for government action to raise wages as well, these minimum wage referenda that passed in so many red states this week. And we as a left, I think something that we always point to and that you're rightfully pointing to here is that we have majority support on so many of our core issues. But what we failed to do so far is to create a bigger story, a bigger narrative, a new form of common sense, something that makes this all compelling as a package, as a cohesive form of politics that people will identify with. If we could run all of our left platform as referenda simultaneously throughout the nation, we'd have social democracy, if not socialism, overnight. But that's not how it works. We need to construct some sort of cohesive political package that appeals to majority, and that's what we haven't figured out.
That's the big hole. That's the big vacuum. It can be described as the distance between what people want and the method, the vessel, the vehicle by which we can achieve that. The Democratic Party has always posited itself like that, at least since the 3/4 of the 20th century. But I think, in some ways, the end of Obama's presidency marked a certain finality in a certain kind of liberalism or a certain kind of belief in liberalism. And I think that this failed campaign of Kamala Harris really closes the coffin on that. It doesn't mean that the Democratic Party is dead. I mean, I think we can all I remember the summer of 2015 when the Republican Party was the laughingstock of the world because they seemed to be serious about putting Donald Trump forward as a presidential campaign. And so in a matter of, fewer than 10 years, I think, by the time he is inaugurated in January, it will be 10 years from laughingstock to the most powerful political party in the world. In the two-party system, your fortunes can change very quickly. But I think there's a structural problem that the Democrats have in that the working class base of the party, the core constituencies, are leeching from the party. And that, to me, is, the most dramatic storyline of this presidential contest is, again, when you look at the exit polls, the $30,000 to $50,000, like solid working class range of voters, majority go to Trump, right? Under $100,000, the majority go to Trump. It was Kamala Harris who won the big money, in the U.S. context, $100,000, $200,000 earners, the 200,000 plus earners. The majority of those voters went to Kamala Harris. If you look at white workers without a college degree, vast majority of them go to Trump. It is true that most Black workers without a college degree went to Harris. And so the sort of base of the Democratic Party is being frittered away. And it's significant portions of it are going to the Republican Party. And then other parts of it have just been left to float away into the ether because no one represents what it is that they want. So this is a structural problem for the Democratic Party. How will they reconstitute a electoral coalition that can give them an ability to compete in these races? And based on the kind of political framework that they are putting forward, which is vapid, vacuous commentary that is nothing speak. And you just think about...
I think the vacuousness is really a big part of it. Poll testing, everything that you say, it comes across to people as insincere plastic bullshit.
Because it is. They just spent in Philadelphia, what has been described as the poorest of the big cities for more than a decade. The last 2 weekends, they've been having rock concerts at downtown, the steps of the Philadelphia Museum. Kamala Harris shouting out Rocky Balboa statue that this is the city of what are you doing? There's a housing crisis in Philadelphia. There is a crisis of poverty in Philadelphia. There are dramatically underfunded public schools in Philadelphia. And the Democrats come rolling in with the celebrities, with the high rollers, and they have nothing to say about any of that except get out the vote. It is an embarrassment. And people pick up on that. And that, to me,
it's insulting to people's intelligence.
It's absolutely insulting people's intelligence. There's that. There is the condescension and arrogance. Barack Obama. So there are two things with Obama. One is I saw this ad on Instagram last week, and it was a young Latino man in his 20s saying, how do you figure out who to vote for? And so there's Barack Obama. And he says, well, you probably look in your neighborhood and it doesn't look like much has changed, I'm sure. But what you don't see is that one of your neighbors has a prescription that she didn't have before. And some other neighbor has a bag of groceries that they didn't have before. And so what you have to understand is that change is incremental. And what you really need to base your vote on is, do you like the person? Do you trust them? And it's just like, what are you talking about? First, it's the low expectations, right? That these people tell us these are the most consequential elections of our lifetimes, and yet we shouldn't expect much. And the mismatch between the low expectations and the idea that change is only incremental, but the rent's not incremental, right? The cost of living that changes from one year to the next is not incremental. And so there's that, but then there's just the lecturing from Barack Obama. Either in this situation, there are all the clips of him telling Muslims to, don't bite your nose off to spite your face, lecturing to Black men that any economic concerns that they have don't exist, that actually it's just sexism. And so there's the condescension of the Democratic Party. There's the elitism of the Democratic Party. And you combine all of this with their absolute inability to change anything on a national level and then on a local level. And so what people have is continuity from one administration to the next. The same sorts of conditions that exist under an Obama administration, exist under a Trump administration, exist under a Biden administration. And so it does feel like, what's the point? What is the point of going out to vote for this or that politician when not much changes for the good in my everyday life? And so I think that there are many different factors that they're going to have to overcome to reconstitute a voting coalition if they have any hope of being relevant in the near future electorally.
We see all these liberal pundits who are saying it's not Kamala's fault, it's the American people's fault, which brings to mind that great Brecht line about dissolving the people and electing the other. Unfortunately, in an electoral democracy, you actually have to win people's votes, and they don't take well to being condescended to. And that's not just amongst, the super party elite in white middle class neighborhoods right adjacent to where I live in Rhode Island. I see these signs everywhere that say Harris, Walz, obviously. And I don't know if you've seen them around. It's unreal, but it also feels sort of exemplary of a problem. And there's a clip circulating in recent days from the late David Graeber, where he argues that there's some kind of sick dialectic connection between this sort of elite liberal smugness that really prioritizes feeling good about oneself and virtue signaling, and then these clown cartoon scam artists, playing dumb on the right.
Yes. No, I mean, I think there's the playing dumb from the Yaleys that is always hilarious and frightening and disgusting to watch. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I think that we should talk about, is I talked about this with my class. I have a class of freshmen, and I was wondering, what their reaction would be. I remember in 2017 or 2016, the reaction was pretty much like someone had been killed. Shock, terror, complete overwhelm and bewilderment. But I think for these young people, they've grown up with Trump as a political figure, where, we grew up with Trump as an entertainer, as a kind of buffoon, as part of a seedy popular culture in the United States, which enhanced the shock value of him becoming president, where for these students of mine, he seems like just a weird kind of unhinged right-wing politician. But one of the things that I think is important to point to is the way that I do think Trump's anger and disgust resonates with people in this artificial world of mainstream politics from either Democrats or Republicans. And there's a way, because Trump isn't offering any plausible solution to those economic issues either. It's not like, oh, well, actually, Trump has the coherent economic plan. His plan for housing is, I'm going to deport 11 million people and you can live in the places they used to live in. I mean, it's absurd. It's dangerous and disgusting, but it is completely, nonsensical and absurd. So it's not like people are looking at two columns of, oh, what is the Trump policy platform offering? It's not that, but it is a kind of thumb in the eye, the finger, and, just kind of an FU to the status quo that I think even if you're not getting anything in return, there's some kind of strange satisfaction in having stuck it to these suits, the scolds, the people who have figured it all out and are here to tell you that you owe them your vote. And so, because there's an aspect of this that is beyond just the kind of bread and butter policy discussion, there's something so stifling and gross about American politics. We think about Trump's rambling rally speeches where people are streaming out. They don't make any sense. And yet they're not the canned political speech that Kamala Harris, Tim Walz offer, that by the 17th time, we knew all of the applause lines. We knew all of the inflections. We knew exactly what they were going to say. And so that is also, I think, a part of the Democratic Party, a part of their political crisis, is that they are the establishment. They are the status quo. And people are tired of that, and they're sick of that because they equate that with the kind of continuity in the conditions of their everyday lives.
And Democrats protecting a status quo that so many people want to destroy, and yet replaying 2016's status quo protection campaign to the ends that we've seen that run this week. I think it's related to which voters the Democratic Party is pursuing. And Democrats, I think, would like to believe that their strategy of courting anti-Trump Republicans, affluent professionals, and suburbanites, that this is somehow unrelated to them losing working class voters. But I think they're obviously related. Courting one for so many reasons entails losing the latter. And it's a process, something I discussed with historian Lily Geismer, I think a couple of years ago, that really took off under the Clinton administration. This is a political choice that entails certain policy choices. Could a multiracial working class be won over to a populist social democratic candidacy that was oriented towards class conflict? And is the basic problem that the Democratic Party, as it's currently constituted, can't do that because they can't wage class conflict against the very elites that they're pursuing as their base?
I think we got a glimpse of that potential. I think the first glimpse of that was 2016 with Bernie Sanders' surprise run. And even though that first run, people criticized Bernie for not having a particularly refined message about the problems of racism in American society. And so we didn't necessarily see the kind of full. I think the campaign was truncated by the end of the primary season before we could see the full integration of like young Black people who were certainly attracted to his political message and the economic reforms that he was championing. But by 2020, clearly Sanders' campaign represented a totally different future for the Democratic Party. It represented the kind of political coalition that we salivate over now, because it did represent the multiracial political movement that I think has all the potential in the world. I mean, we can see the potential. To me, we can see the potential more clearly now than in the last 50 years. The kind of mutual evisceration of Black, white, and Latino life in this country that's played out. I mean, we could talk about the economic categories or statistics. The other measurements, the study about the deaths of working class white people that came out right before the pandemic, the so-called deaths by despair, in which ordinary white working class people without college degrees were dying of drug addiction, opioid addiction, alcoholism, and suicide. And you map that with what has happened post-pandemic, through the pandemic to now, with Black working class people, the rate at which white people were dying quicker, apparently, according to the study. Black working class people have caught up with them. And so the mutual immiseration of the lives of the multiracial working class absolutely lays the political foundation for a movement of that sort. And the problem is not that that potential doesn't exist, is that the problem is that it has not been a part of any real political initiative in the US. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is how a movement like Black Lives Matter, which was so important in terms of raising the profile of the impact of racism in the lives of Black people in this country, in ways that is even hard to appreciate now because it's become such an accepted and understood aspect of life for Black people in the United States. If you think about that 10 years, 13, 14, 15 years earlier, where there's really an absence of discussion about the impacts of racism in the lives of Black people. And so Black Lives Matter plays a very important role in doing that. And one of the other things that the best parts of the movement did was demonstrate how the working class character of Black life is part of what made Black people vulnerable to policing and to the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal legal system. And so the problem, though, is that a movement focused purely or exclusively on the lives of Black people actually doesn't have the social capacity to transform those conditions that make Black people vulnerable to policing in the first place. So if we say that social inequality, economic inequality is at the center of that vulnerability, then it actually takes a mass movement to transform that. And a movement that defines itself as Black Lives Matter is not the vehicle that can actually build the mass multiracial movement that is necessary, because something has to capture the radicalization of white people and transform that into politics as well. So we saw in 2020, one of the reasons why the backlash was triggered was because of the radicalization of young white people, because millions of white people were marching against racism, sometimes in places where there were no Black people. And we have a left that often responds so cynically to that, right? Like, oh, what do you want, a cookie for fighting racism? And it's like, no, people don't want cookies for fighting racism. But like, this is an important development in our political movement to try to build the type of mass movement that's necessary to change the social and political conditions that are disproportionately affecting Black people, but that are affecting the entire working class and poor people in this country. And so that's the kind of vehicle that we need to organize and to build. And without that, what we're seeing is that the Republicans have tried to step successfully into that political vacuum, right? Like they do. I mean, we can say that Trump's political platform, his policy platform, his economic plans are ridiculous and make no sense. But what the Republicans are doing is offering a narrative to explain why your life chances, your quality of life have gone into the toilet. We're going to offer you an explanation. We're going to blame immigrants for doing that. And we're going to blame crime. We're going to offer an explanation for this. The Democrats don't have an explanation for why this has
No.
happened. And so there's an incredible, and the left
They don't have an explanation because they don't have an enemy. Because the enemy is the base that they're hoping to have.
No, absolutely. This is a political problem. And the left, there's some parts of it that try to relate to the anger and despair of working class people, but often it's turned into, the discourse of white privilege, which just sounds ridiculous when you look at the absolute destruction of working class white life in this country. There's the other part of the left that, will crucify you if you say the wrong thing, including, in the past week that you're going to vote for Kamala Harris because you're afraid of Donald Trump. Makes you a genocide apologist. I mean, I understand the sentiment, but it's difficult to grow beyond what you are if you see everyone as the problem or everyone as a potential enemy. And so it means that the explanations that the left has, this is capitalism, this is racism, that this economy is set up to fail for working class people, that we need to redistribute the wealth, that we need to not give the U.S. Department of Defense nearly $1 trillion every year, that we don't need to give Israel tens of billions of dollars while our schools, hospitals, public infrastructure is completely falling apart, on and on and on. All of the arguments that the left could be offering to fill this political void go unheard, because often the left cuts itself off from that audience because there's a critique of everything and everyone. There's a sense of acrimony. The left is inhospitable to people who are not like it. And so what we are reduced to then is groups of friends and groups of like-minded people who like to stay that way. We can't grow like that. We can't get big like that.
Little study groups in sex, which some people I think really actually kind of perversely yearn to return to the comfort of, because being in mass politics and organizing, say, tenants in a building, some of whom are Trump voters, and
Yes.
you need every single person
Yes.
on board. That is what a tenant union looks like. That is what a labor union looks like. That's what
the working class
a
looks
mass
like.
movement.
Yes.
That's what the working class
Yes.
looks like. Yeah. And there is a certain type of identity politics that really does play into the right hands. And this is something that mainstream analysts, we were passing this absurd New York Times article, we were discussing that ahead of the election, that mainstream analysts have really glommed onto, but they've done so in a really, really confused and confusing way. Because in fact, the upshot isn't selling out racial justice or trans people. It's building a big movement that tells a cohesive, compelling story about what's going on in this country and how to fix it, and that invites everybody in.
That has solidarity at its core. And the old Knights of Labor slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all, and really explicating what that looks like and what that means. And we were onto something with that in 2020. And that is part of the reason why the backlash was so fierce. I wrote about how Scott Walker, the former governor of Wisconsin, said in 2022, when the Republicans were washed out in the midterm elections, that this is because of the multicultural curriculums in schools, that, if we don't change or address this, that the Republicans will never win another election. And part of that was also not just critical race theory, not just that, but a reaction to young white people marching militantly in the streets against racism. And so that was a critical opportunity to not just come out of 2020 having dumped Trump, but really building a vehicle that could grow. And instead, all of that energy got diverted into getting Joe Biden elected, then got diverted again into the Georgia Senate, races in January, and then was demobilized, really. And so if you think about it, Joe Biden, even as he was backing away from his promises, doing the bidding of Republicans in deconstructing the emergency COVID state, faced no resistance, faced no opposition. The only hint of opposition and resistance to Joe Biden came last spring with the eruption of the Palestinian solidarity protests, because it was the one issue that could not be co-opted into the Democratic Party in ways that Black Lives Matter could, in ways that the immigrant rights movement could, in ways that certainly the LGBT movement could. And so this is part of the problem, the demobilization. And so here we are, faced with renewed political attacks, still lacking those vehicles to respond in a mass way. It doesn't mean that people won't respond and that we can't respond, because people inevitably will when Trump tries to initiate deportations and all of the horrible things that he has promised to do. But the left, we have big problems. The fracturing of the left, the lack of political vehicles, the entanglement with the Democratic Party, which meant that, it's not like the Joe Biden just pushed a button and, the left is demobilized. It's also about how groups who believe that access within the Democratic Party gives them the ear of officials in the Democratic Party, and perhaps that is the most effective way to get change. So these are parts of political debates that need to happen, strategic debates, tactical debates about what it is that we should be doing and how it is that we build ourselves out of the current crisis that we're in right now.
And I think we need to have those debates in, if possible, a comradely fashion. And that really assesses the conjuncture and possible paths forward strategically rather than moralistically.
Absolutely.
Which probably means not on Twitter.
Well, but I think that is actually a big thing. Like, how do we build our way out of this? Are we going to do it on these online platforms? Can we get in rooms together? Can we talk to each other? And some of it sounds like, what are you talking about? This sounds so, is it touchy-feely? I don't know. But there is a culture problem in the left, the hostility, the intolerance, which I think has conclusively been proven to be a feature of online engagement. And so something has to change, because there's not just going to be cycles of, well, this is just like 2016, 2017, Trump comes in, there's going to be a resistance, and then we resist and resist and resist and have a confrontation, and then funnel all of our resources to get, Josh Shapiro elected as president. It's not happening, because the Democratic Party's core constituencies are breaking off, are falling out. And so there's a real question about what can be done, what is to be done, what we can do, that have to be seriously addressed. There's this idea, I think, from liberals that, this has happened before, we confronted this before, let's have a women's march, in January. And things are worse. Things are materially worse for people. I think that the Trump administration is not going to be surprised. They were just as surprised as everyone else when they won in 2016. Stephen Miller has been planning since 2020 about how to get back to the White House and get every Spanish-speaking person in this country deported. So that Project 2025 is unfortunately a real thing. Like, they have a plan of governance. It doesn't mean that they can go in and just hit a button and execute the entire thing, but but this is not the surprise, oh my God, we have power. This is, yes, we're returning to power.
Yeah,
we have plans.
And they're no kind of old school establishment Republicans or deep state figures who are going to be in the room to mess it up for him. They've got a team that's ready to go.
They have the government. They have all the chambers of Congress and the Supreme Court. This is not 2016.
I think you're rightfully pointing out the pitfalls of so much of the liberal and left liberal NPIC just banking everything on defeating Trump and then relying on access to the Biden White House. But then conversely, on the left, I think debates about the electoral project we've had over the past decade or so have become so fraught because there are clear limitations to it. And we're obviously not fully anywhere close to fully winning yet. But I want to reiterate what you said about Bernie 2020 and then expand on it. Not only did it trace the outlines of a possible working class multiracial majority, I mean, especially given what's happening with Latino voters right now, look at California and Nevada and the vanguard role that working class Latinos played in the social democratic struggle in 2020. But then secondly, just as a counterfactual that we experienced, look at a presidential cycle where there's no Democratic primary and there's absolutely no left pole in the debate. Everything lurched way to the right.
No, everything lurched to the right to such an extent that the influence of 2020 was airbrushed from history. This, to me, was one of the most shocking developments with the Harris campaign, was the just complete disconnect, removal of Black Lives Matter, of the anti-racist movement. The most sort of dramatic example of that happens with the Democratic Party platform, where the Democratic Party had an opposition to the death penalty, for example, as part of its platform since 2012, and they took it out. That
was so gratuitous. Who was even looking to check that? You know what I mean? It was just wow.
You don't want to be weak on the death penalty. I mean, it is like 1994. And so you remove that. You remove any reference to police brutality. You remove any reference really to police reform, to discrimination. And so part of the
And you attack Trump for not finishing his border wall rather than condemning the idea of the border wall.
Yes. We're going to sign the bill that spends $1 billion to finish the wall. That originally, right, Kamala Harris called a medieval vanity project. And so all that kind of thing too. The flip-flop. Fracking is horrible. Fracking is terrible. We can't do it. To, oh yeah, I support fracking. In fact, my administration expanded fracking. So, I mean, there's that element too. But with Black Lives Matter, it was surprising to me the extent to which that part of the discussion was left out of the assessment about why are Black people in general so lukewarm with Kamala Harris. I mean, eventually Black women matched the votes with Harris with what they had been with Biden, but Black women had also been trailing in support. And I think that people have underestimated what it means to have Kamala Harris, a Black woman running for president, refuse to speak about racism, refuse to talk about racism as part of the campaign, when this has really been an era, a 10-year period of struggles around Black Lives Matter. And I believe that it was the abandonment of anti-racism as well as the continuity of economic marginalization and inequality experienced by working class and poor Black people that, first of all, meant the free fall of Black support for Joe Biden, but that then was transferred to Kamala Harris as well. And there are other aspects of this that don't even warrant discussion in the mainstream media. The abolition of affirmative action. And even though those decisions, the Supreme Court decision, affected a small number of Black people, and I think there was a poll taken shortly after in the Washington Post that said only 11% of Black people said that this had anything to do with them. but it set a tone around a permissiveness around racial discrimination that you could then see play out with the attacks on DEI, which also affect probably a relatively small number of Black people, but change the environment and discussion around racism, so much so that you then have Republicans denying that racism is an issue, denying that racial inequality is an issue. And so very quickly, programs that might affect small numbers of Black people change the political atmosphere that affects the vast majority of Black people. And then all of a sudden, you feel as if the issues that are most important to you are being ignored and excluded. So you have polling that shows that vast majorities of Black people think that racism is responsible for putting limits on their ability to ascend socially in American society. Vast majorities of Black people who think that the system is rigged against them. Vast majorities of Black people who think prisons were set up to particularly constrain and hold them back. Pew classified this under, Black conspiracy theories, but this is actually about Black life in the United States. And when you end discussions about racism, which the Democratic Party self-imposed, we don't want to be woke, right? So we're not going to talk about affirmative action. We don't want to be woke, so we're going to take DEI out of the party platform. But in the eyes of Black voters, you can be cynical and Black and be like, well, of course they have to do this. And then at the same time, it feels like, once again, the issues that are affecting us are completely marginalized and disappeared. And even if it doesn't come out as a sharp critique, it does come out as a kind of whatever about this election. And that is part of the disaffection with the Democratic Party that they have no solutions for, because we don't want to talk about racism, because we don't want to be the woke party. And we don't want to talk about all of these issues that somehow can be subscribed to wokeism, which then leaves us not a lot to talk about when trying to reconstitute the electoral coalition that we once had.
I'm Master Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, a podcast for people who want to deeply understand the world and organize to change it. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
The Dig is a podcast produced in conjunction with Jacobin Magazine. And yes, Jacobin is a print publication, not just a place for online commentary, but long-form, serious print journalism and socialist analysis. The magazine is released quarterly and runs at around 160 pages, filled with award-winning design and the ideas that movements need to thrive. You can join more than 70,000 Jacobin subscribers supporting this vital work for just $15 for your first year. This is a huge discount available to Dig listeners. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's very extensive archive. You can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. There's a link in the show notes. We, for obvious reasons, keep mentioning Gaza, and I think the Democratic Party adopting essentially a fascist position on Palestine, supporting a settler colonial genocide of a mostly refugee population, and in doing so, to defend that, waging an all-out political war against, major constituencies that are typically Democratic voters, smearing huge swaths of American college students as anti-Semitic extremists. I think this has been a key thing that has facilitated the larger rightward move of the Democratic Party. I mean, obviously, exit polls show us, and just, common sense shows us that, your median voter who showed up on Tuesday, Gaza was not their number one issue. But I think it was arguably decisive in Michigan, for one. And I think it had huge knock-on effects across the board in terms of alienating young people, alienating progressives, obviously alienating Arabs and Muslims. And it was this kind of putting the Biden administration into the most brutal form of conflict with these portions of its base, not only alienated those portions of its base in a really profound way, unlike anything I've seen in my entire life in politics. I've never been so disgusted by a Democratic ticket as someone who's been disgusted by pretty much all of them, or all of them since in my entire adult political life. But it's also, I think, part and parcel of what made the Harris-Cheney alliance almost inevitable, because where else was she going to go after a year of their administration demonizing the anti-war alternative?
So again, I was trying to talk to my students, because they wanted to talk about the election. And it's a class on politics, so it made sense to do so. And one of the things that, they were struggling to understand is why the Liz Cheney campaigning was causing such a visceral reaction for some people. And, these are 18-year-olds, and they have absolutely no recollection of the Iraq War. And so I was trying to explain the hypocrisy and the betrayal, really. Like, Barack Obama became president running against Dick Cheney, the architect of the Iraq War. And to just erase that history, I mean, it was really demonstrative of the way that the Democratic Party engages in its own self-induced amnesia. Like, we always talk about the right and the kind of ham-fisted attacks on history that the right engage in. They ban books and ban classes and change curricula. But the Democratic Party is engaged in the same kind of exercise in parading Liz Cheney around as some kind of hero because she doesn't like Donald Trump, or Kamala Harris thanking Dick Cheney for his service to the nation. Like, what on earth does that even mean? And so I think that it lends itself to the utter cynicism that regular people hold this party in. And so when you look at the age categories of people and how they're voting, that has to be a part of the mix. Some of us remember the U.S. war in Iraq. Many of us remember that. And to see Liz Cheney paraded around as some kind of hero for purely partisan reasons is really disgusting. I think that kind of cynicism really activated the anger and disgust of young people. So their war with the U.S. sponsorship of the Israeli siege on Palestine. So you could see that Harris's numbers in terms of 18 to 29-year-olds voting for her compared to Biden also fell off dramatically. And it's not the war in Gaza is not the number one issue, but I think in terms of activating a sense of cynicism, activating what we sometimes refer to as the enthusiasm gap, that is certainly a part of it. And a big part of it has to do with Kamala Harris's pathetic response, which is, yes, I know thousands of people appear to be getting killed, and I'm not going to do a single thing to change any aspect of the policy. And so I think, some consultant told her that it's good to empathize with the pain people feel, so you should say something about how tragic it is, the number of people who are being killed, but then make sure that Israel cannot become a political issue for you. And so even if it's not your central issue, it just is another example of the political doublespeak that these people engage in, which underscore the utter insincerity that they have in politics. And so it all kind of builds on each other. And then the last thing I'll say about this particular issue and how it factors into the collapsing support for the Democratic Party is the way that this election has been framed as our last-ditch effort at saving democracy. I mean, there's something else to say about these people tell us that Trump is a fascist, that democracy is on the ballot, that this may be the very last election we can ever participate in. And yes, we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power. We're going to hand the keys to the White House over to Trump on January 20th, and we're going to come together as Americans. I'm sorry, what?
It's not congruent.
It makes no sense. And it underlines the utter lack of seriousness of this party, because it's like either that was a gimmick and you didn't really mean it, and so now you look like idiots, or what are you talking about? This person is going to be responsible for ending democracy. He's going to be a dictator on day one and just give him the keys to the White House? I'm sorry, what? So Israel, Palestine, the fact that Biden really gave the okay for the crackdown by the police last April by saying publicly to the press, characterizing the solidarity protest, the Palestinian solidarity protest, as violent, as anti-Semitic, but particularly as violent, gave the signal to administrators and the police that it was fine to go on the attack. And I think students recognize that and remember that and saw, on the one hand, we're told that the Republicans are the big threat to democracy. Republicans are the threat to free speech and to the freedom to think and all that. And yet it's Democratic mayors who are calling out the police to beat the hell out of protesters, to shut protesters up, to move protesters off of the streets, to attack protesters. And it's, probably liberally aligned college administrators who also colluded with law enforcement and police to repress student protests. Not to mention the absolute double standard around free speech, where free speech or speech in support and solidarity with the Palestinian struggle is absolutely policed and repressed. Anything said about Israel is surveilled, is looked at with a microscope with the intention of finding an excuse to punish, to marginalize, and to silence. And so these contradictions are clear to anyone paying attention. And we know that tens of thousands of students around the country were paying attention. And so it didn't need to be the number one issue. It needed to be one of 1,000 cuts that really leached any kind of enthusiasm and hope that this campaign would represent something different. And again, could cause people to equivocate or to just feel like it really doesn't matter. Because if it was your issue, you had no candidate in this campaign. And even if it wasn't your central issue, the position of Kamala Harris was such a representation of the status quo that it had to cast a pall over everything that she claimed to be running on.
I think and worry that if we see a new wave of serious repression of the left, unlike anything we've seen in my lifetime under Trump, I think we will look back and see these liberal elected officials and administrators as having set important precedents and having legitimated it.
And it's not just on Palestine. Like the attacks on Palestine, on Palestinian solidarity, are the Trojan horse. Because you think about at many of these college campuses where there's a tremendous amount of union activity. Well, they've changed the rules around protest. They've changed the rules not just around political content, but take Princeton, for example. You can no longer protest in front of the main administrative building if it exceeds the size of the sidewalk. So you can no longer be on any grass in front of the main administrative building. Now, of course, the main administrative building is a central target for students because that's where the president's office is, that's where the provost is. But if you're in a union on campus, that's where your employer is. That's where the boss is. You know, they don't say, well, just for pro-Palestine marches or protests, you can't be on the grass. It's for any protest. And so it is both the repression of Palestinian solidarity on campus, but it is also using that to address other issues as campuses themselves radicalize in the sort of awakening of the campus as a workplace, the campus as a site of political and economic conflict. They're using these protests to change many rules that will manage the way that these conflicts play out.
The repression that Stop Cop City protesters have faced feels like perhaps the most foreboding example of what we could be facing.
I mean, one thing to think about with Cop City, and I've been thinking a lot about this, is I would be interested in seeing the exit polls from Atlanta and just the way that the overwhelming and tremendous repression of the activist movement there, how that plays out politically. Because I do think, you know, if I'm thinking about this as death by 1,000 cuts for the Democratic Party, how does local rule and the local repression of the Democratic Party affect the overall enthusiasm, interest, engagement of ordinary Democratic voters? Because you think of someplace like Atlanta, where the repression of Cop City was so craven, reckless, abusive, that then the same political apparatus turns out and says, that's why we got to get Kamala out. That's why we got to get the vote out. I mean, there's a disconnect there. You see that in Philly, not to the same extent, not yet, but the new mayor is not liked very much, is ramming through a multi-billion-dollar new stadium for the local basketball team, the 76ers.
In the middle of one of this country's most precious Chinatowns.
Yes. The activists and organizers from Chinatown have been ignored, have been completely marginalized. She has refused to meet with them. But even beyond that, it has no support. The developers support it. A very small portion of people support this. No one likes this. And so again, you have these local officials doing terrible things who then turn around and say, yeah, that's why we got to get out the vote. And so, you know, I don't think it's the most consequential thing, but I do think there is something to say about the mismanagement, the political mismanagement of the Democratic Party, the face of local repression from the Democratic Party on the local level. That is also a part of this mix that we have to take stock of. Because you can see Trump's numbers in New York, in Philadelphia,
in Rhode Island,
in LA, everywhere. It's not just suburban and rural white people. Inroads everywhere, in the heart of Americans, in Chicago. You cannot disconnect that from the utter dysfunction of the Democratic Party in local politics.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I am redoubling my own commitment to building organized left power in an organized working class, in my case in Rhode Island, through tenant organizing and housing justice, because, I mean, not only is it a good in and of itself, but we need to make deep blue states and cities into social democratic models, not only as an end unto itself, but there's no strategy for national power that doesn't run through functional and appealing models at the local and state level.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think that in that sense, you know, all politics is local, but those local politics are connected to the dysfunctions of the national party as well. And I think it also has to influences the dynamics around race and the dynamics around class, because increasingly in these cities, we have Black mayors, increasingly Black women who are at the helm of these cities, and it brings the issue of class to the surface in Black politics and in these local arenas. And I do think that this has an impact that plays out in national politics as well. But it means, for the left, it means that we have to take up the local issues too, and not just the national debates, the national campaigns. And so, where are you? How are you organized on a local basis? And how do we connect local struggles to national struggles to make sure that we have coalitions that exist on different levels as the foundation for building the mass movement that we've been talking about?
To be self-critical here, we've been talking a lot about the Democratic Party fueling mass cynicism and disaffection, which is all very true. But there's also a real challenge for us on the left in reaching rank and file liberal Democratic Party stalwarts, not the establishment party elite, but rather the millions of ordinary Americans who continue to make up the Democratic Party base. These are people who are Black, who are union members. These are people who are still the minority, but maybe like a third, of working class, non-college educated white voters who have not flipped to Trump. And these are rank and file liberals, I think, who in many ways share our values and our goals, but who are often baffled by our project, or baffled that we're not enthusiastically cheering Harris on. I met these people all the time campaigning for Bernie in 2020 who were like, yes, I agree with you on the issues, but the Democratic Party as presently constituted is our best bet to achieve justice in this world. And I experienced it in a very weird way being an alternate uncommitted delegate in Chicago. I think a lot of people don't know what we were doing on a day-to-day basis there, but by and large, what we were doing for the first few days is walking around with a QR code that would take delegates to a sign-on letter calling for an arms embargo. So I was one-on-oneing with delegates who are just like, a retiree on this Democratic Party county committee in Florida, or a school principal who just got elected as a delegate, just very random party base. And I didn't meet a single person who was like, what Israel is doing is good. I met people who signed the letter, and that was great. And then I met the people who wouldn't, they would say basically like, Biden's trying his best to end this war. The war's bad though. And it's like, these actually were kind of exemplars of these like ordinary liberals who, as part of any kind of winning coalition, I think we really need.
Oh, no, absolutely. And this, connects to what we were talking about earlier, which is, how does the left become hospitable? And so in addition to that, I think we have to think about, what are the entry points? How do we create on-ramps, entry points into organization, into discussions about this? And this is, to me, an important part of left culture that has to be regenerated, which is one of political discussion and debate. There are so many questions that not just questions that people have that, we're here to answer, but questions about politics, questions about history, questions about how did we get here, questions about the nature of our society, and no place to engage with them. And so again, it means that the space within which these discussions happen are with Fox News, with cable news. Those are the places where those discussions are happening. And so, of course, you can get a podcast, or you can, get some kind of forum online. But this is fundamentally different from bringing people together to talk about these things, and then not just to talk about them, but to figure out what it is that we do. And so that's one part of it. To me, that's just basic organization building. How do we create climate culture where people can engage in debate and discussion? But then there's the other part about it that seems daunting and overwhelming, and who knows how to do this. But I mean, there's so many examples. But if this election season does not demonstrate that we have to figure out what the alternative to this Democratic Party is, like a real third party, I don't know what else needs to happen to demonstrate that. I mean, that in and of itself is a debate, right? Can we just take over the Democratic Party? I'm deeply skeptical about our ability to do that, because the Democratic Party is a party. As a party, is really a figment of our imagination. It's not a Democratic Party. It's not a party in which ordinary people can come into it, act as a rank and file, and dictate and determine what the direction of that party is.
The Republican and Democratic parties wouldn't qualify as political parties in any other electoral democracy.
No, exactly. And so the idea that, well, it's too hard to create an alternative, and so what we really need to do is focus on the transformation of the Democratic Party. I don't see any precedent for that. I don't see a route to that. And so while I can agree that a viable third party seems and feels very impossible, I don't know if it's any more impossible than the idea that somehow we can transform this utterly corporate, utterly bought and paid for, undemocratic party, that we can transform that. I don't see the route to that. And so I also think that creating a third party alternative is not something that you can just map out, create an outline, and we take 1, 2, 3 steps, we'll be there. I think that it's possible in a situation like we had in 2020, where you have millions of people who are activated, who are marching and desperately trying to do something. But I don't know exactly what the route is to doing that. I do know that the Democratic Party, I don't believe, is a receptacle that we can take over and change. And yet the sentiment and the desire for a vehicle that can bridge that gap that we talked about earlier between what it is that people want and what is necessary to achieve it, the desire for that exists. And we have to figure out what is the route to making that happen. What is the mechanism that is necessary to make that a possibility? Because this ain't it.
I'm not at all optimistic about taking over or transforming the Democratic Party, but I'm maybe even more pessimistic, at least about the short or medium terms, for a third party. Both of us have been around for a while, and I would put out as just like what I would argue is a stark point of comparison. Nader 2000, which was my first big electoral involvement. I was 17, I couldn't vote, but I threw everything into that campaign. I went to the mega rallies. It felt like the earth was moving beneath my feet, and then he couldn't even get 5%. I think he got 2 or 3 or something. And then Bernie 2020 and 2016, running within the party, mobilized so many millions more people to a left vision than we ever had been able to before, and certainly more than Nader did in 2000, which was really the high watermark for left third waterism, and it was a low high watermark. So my worry about third partyism is attempting to do that without building the organized workplace and social power first will be a sort of cul-de-sac in which we pour a lot of energy without much result. and please the Democratic Party in doing so, because I think that they would prefer us not to run Bernie's primaries.
No, I completely, an initiative around a third party can't be a boutique project of a handful of left sects who want to get together and then who can't agree on even like what to put on the agenda, right? Like that can't be the vision. And so that's sort of what I meant when I was saying that it has to be something born out of a mass political situation in the first place. And yet also there has to be organizing in the interim, because we know that in the midst of tens of millions of people marching and being activated, you can't just throw, oh, now we're going to have a third party. You can't just throw that together. And so I'm not 100% clear, but I do know that Bernie's run in 2020 in particular showed the potential on the one hand, but it also showed the extent to which the Democratic Party will close ranks in a heartbeat to destroy an alternative in its midst. There's, the Working Families Party, which exists as a thing, but that also seems to also function as an apparatus of the Democratic Party and not necessarily as an independent entity. And so I don't know exactly what process or procedure we would look at to change these dynamics. But I do know that there is a desperate desire for a political alternative. And it's not, Trump will attract some people, but the bigger issue is just the bottom falling out and people just being frittered into the ether.
And we need to catch them.
No, this is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They will be left on their own, to their own devices, contributing to the crisis of mental health, of loneliness, of despair. And so what that alternative looks like, I don't exactly know, but the desire for it is very real. And this election, I think, has shown there are plenty of things that we can point to that have shown that. Bernie's runs in 2016 and 2020, which brought actual genuine excitement into politics and showed the possibility of being organized and into politics. And so there are plenty of examples that the desire is there. The vehicle has not presented itself. That, that's part of the task. That's part of the challenge that we face.
I mean, one entity that comes to mind that we haven't mentioned is DSA, which is riven by really kind of brutal internal debates nationally in many places right now. But I'll point to New York City DSA that maybe does begin to point towards this model of a kind of a party behind the party that operates as a party even while running its candidates in Democratic primaries. They have a substantial number of people in the state legislature and the city council who I believe do move somewhat in block formation, in a party-like formation. And now we have Zohran Mamdani's run for mayor, which, I don't think he's exactly predicted to be a likely winner at this point. But number one, who knows? Number two, he will, without question, I think, be a major force, and he'll be a force that drags the whole debate left, particularly on housing and rent control. So I think New York City DSA in particular is an interesting thing that merits closer study.
I think there are big debates to have about left electoralism, right? Because I think New York might be a particular model. There's a curious thing developing in Chicago where Brandon Johnson has been mayor for a year and a half. And, there have been questions that have developed about his political leadership. There is an ongoing confrontation over the Chicago public schools. regardless of the minutia with that, one thing is clear is that, or it looks clear from afar, that the Chicago left there is trying to deal with the contradiction of what do you do when it's your person in office? How do you navigate that? And how do you negotiate that? Especially when the mayor might have a proclivity to invoking those relationships, and his part of the left in Chicago historically to explain policies that are incongruent with the left project there. And so you have a left that feels constrained because it's their guy in office. And then you have your guy in office who is invoking his relationship to the left to explain why he is enacting certain policies and practices that under other circumstances the left might be protesting. And so my fear is that dynamic is more the norm than what may exist in New York. And so to me, it means that there's still big questions about the electoral projects of the left and to what extent do they undermine other kinds of organizing. And it doesn't mean to be kind of just have a knee-jerk opposition to electoral politics, which I know, there may be a certain section of the left that just dismisses electoralism out of hand. But I do think that there's always a potential issue with resources and capacity, and that electoralism can very easily present itself as the more reasonable, pragmatic, practical approach to politics. And then we have the issues with access and what happens when those political figures are in your organization and there is a certain amount of pressure to, well, we can work it out. Let's just have a meeting, to not initiate the protests, to not initiate activism for the sake of preserving the relationship. And so all of these things, they have to do with the balance of forces and what the level of struggle is and what is happening. But these are serious issues that have to be considered in terms of what are the strategies and tactics that the left needs to deploy in order to wield influence, to be effective, and to grow, and to be able to actually grow in size.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we definitely, about these, there are inherent contradictions and at certain points, trade-offs that need to be debated, assessed, and planned around. And I think what's important is that we be able to have spaces and organizations to have these sorts of strategic discussions that don't feel so zero-sum and thus render rivals into enemies, or people
Yes.
who have a different take, because ultimately the solution to some of these will be, okay, different groups are going to try different things, and we're
Right.
not going to consider each other our enemies.
It's an important point to emphasize, which is part of the problem that, as I see it, is that in some ways we've put the cart before the horse. And to use that metaphor, the horse has already left the barn. So it's not like we can go back. But in many spaces, we don't have that culture of democracy, debate, political accountability. And so we have emphasized the electoral projects before we actually have the structures for political assessment, political accountability, actual democratic influence over the electeds who operate within our midst, because the electoral project is easier to actually engage with and unleash than establishing these kind of democratic norms within within our organizations. So it means then that while there are many different campaigns that we can point to that may have varying degrees of success or failure, that the relationship then between the organized forces that help to propel those candidates into office is still somewhat murky. Like what is the true relationship, between AOC and DSA? I mean, she's still in DSA, I don't know. But it feels like AOC is doing her own thing. And so,
Certainly.
these are the questions that we have to ask, but that are easy to kind of circumvent because the campaign itself is easier to initiate and get underway.
I want to ask you about a major and increasingly weird ideological challenge I think we face, exemplified by the role of Elon Musk on the Trumpist far right. And I think it's important, including in terms of multiracial working class dealignment, because in the absence of a left populist alternative, what we're seeing, I think, is neoliberalism remaking so many people into wannabe entrepreneurs, aspiring to make money from crypto or landlordism, any sort of escape from wage labor hell through hustling hard, achieving the new American dream of passive income. What do you?
That's what Harris was offering, right?
Yeah. So
crypto and weed.
Yeah, that was to black men.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you?
Fucking ridiculous.
What do you make of this fierce attachment? This fierce attachment to these avatars of American capitalism at the very moment when people feel more crushed by American capitalism than ever. And what kind of model for being in the world are we putting forward as an alternative?
It feels like the only way out. Man, I will tell you, one of the first demonstrations I went to when I moved to Chicago in the late 90s, early aughts, it was Jesse Jackson organized this protest. There was a public school that was across the street from a brand new juvenile jail that was huge, white. It mirrored building. It took up, I think, 2 or 3 city blocks, and it towered over everything. And so he had called this protest at an elementary school because they only had one functioning toilet. And so the teachers in the building would organize the students on the second floor to make a trip down to the basement to use the bathroom once or twice a day. And so Jackson was drawing attention to the obvious contradiction of this multi-million-dollar facility to jail Black kids and this public school that had one functioning toilet in the basement. And so why is basketball, boxing, MMA, rapping, why is all this pop? It's a way out. It's a way out when nothing else seems to work, in which you can't plausibly imagine anything working. If you go into your average working class Black neighborhood school, there is no way in most of these schools that you walk in with any expectation that you can walk out and be set on the path to having the kind of quality of life for you, for your family. No one thinks that. The jobs that are available to young Black people, just like the jobs that are available to young working class, rural, poor white people, offer you no future, no hope. We wonder why there are deaths by despair, whether they are Black people in despair or white people in despair. It's because we live in a society where there is no hope. And it's true. It is absolutely true. People are bonded to debt. with no job that can pay that debt. So it means a lifetime of shitty work that you don't want to do, that is meaningless, and that is the future that they have made for us. So much so that Kamala Harris talked about for 5 minutes a 5% rent cap until she realized that actually you can't guarantee something like that, right? Especially if you want to surround yourself with the Mark Cubans of the world, with the nice billionaires, the liberal billionaires. Like, they don't want to be hearing about rent caps. And so we live in a society that guarantees you the right to a job that can't pay your bills, to a place to live, that the rise in rent is unchecked, that a landlord can charge you anything he determines you're able to pay, that sees an increase in evictions, that underfunds every aspect of its public sector. And then we wonder why you want to be a rapper. You want to be a basketball player. You want to be Elon Musk. Who the hell doesn't want to be a billionaire when that is your social reality? And so clearly the way that you transform that is that people have to have hope that their lives can be different. And hope is not a cheap religiosity that some divine intervention can change this. It's a union job. It's more than a living wage. It is capped rent, right? It's rent that's 20% of your income. It's parks. It's libraries. It's healthcare. It's free college, not student loans, free college. It's transportation. It's vacation. It's like peace of mind. It's quiet. It's connection. It's friendships. It's relationships. That is what supplants the stupidity of the kind of vapid, venal billionaire psychosis with, Trump and his gold sneakers, Elon Musk and his rocket phallus. These are cartoon figures, but that they are animated through the hopelessness of the society as the way that it is. And we know this. We know this as a society. That's why people have the polls with the huge majorities who want to use our public resources to make people's lives better. Like, ordinary people recognize this. If you have a good life, that is the secret to a long and meaningful life. But that's hard to achieve in this society. That's hard to achieve in a society that promises you absolutely nothing except the right or capacity to find a job that is utterly meaningless and that can't afford you or your family members a decent quality of life. And, that's what this struggle is about, is how to have a good life and not a life of debt and meaningless work.
To close out, I think we would both agree that the left has nowhere near the sort of mass organization that we require to govern instead of sort of meekly petition the governing class. Where should we be focusing strategically our organizing efforts? I mean, two things that come to mind to me always are labor and housing.
Well, I think labor is paramount, and it's often missing in our discussions about what the future holds. We look at police brutality, we look at this campaign, we look at that campaign. But really, I think in order to make a qualitative difference, these campaigns actually have to be connected to the labor movement. And so, I think Chicago Teachers Union has always been a powerful example of how you tie bread and butter issues to the broader social issues and what they and others describe as social movement unionism. And so I think there need to be more discussions and collaborations like that. I think Sean Fain at the UAW is kind of a figure cut from that mold. And to what extent has Fain been drawn into some of these broader political conversations about where do we go from here? And not just, I know that there is, Fain has been instrumental in stacking contracts for 2028, which I think is a, exemplar strategy. And how do we connect that to the social movements, right? How do we connect that to the social questions, the political questions that we know in this period, find organizational expression? And so that is a key issue. And then, I think that the question of labor and the insurgent union drives are important in the sense that these are often young people who are at work, but who are also connected to these other kinds of social questions. And so to me, the big issue is the need to break through this wall that sees the labor movement as some kind of old thing over there, and the social movements that don't really have the political, economic, or social weight to accomplish their goals. How do we bring these things together? And again, that is always those things don't happen out of good luck. They don't happen because they should. They happen because of political organizing. They happen because of political perspectives. And that is what we have to create the space for. And that has been part of the ongoing frustration, is that we haven't created the spaces to map out those kinds of tactical, strategic, political discussions that are linked to historical, theoretical discussions about what is it that we're fighting for? What is the ultimate intention of all of this activism? That has to be also integrated into the discussion about what kind of activism or movement facilitates the possibility of the kind of social transformation that we're talking about. And so these are multi-level conversations, because very quickly there will be lots for us to respond to. If we can think back, even though 2016, 2017 won't repeat itself, in the same way, we have some indication, right? That part of Trump's strategy in 2017 was, I think we described it as shock and awe, that there were just so many outrageous things happening at the same time as a way to really overwhelm the left, because you'd have to respond to the Muslim ban. He's appointing, the CEO of Exxon to be the head of the EPA. He's appointing some horrible New York developer to be the head of HUD. They will try to pass abortion ban. They probably won't start with the abortion ban. They'll start with legislation that makes the morning after pill illegal. I mean, there will be an onslaught of things that we will be forced to respond to. But what can't happen is that the rapid response to the shock and awe of the Trump administration undermines these bigger political questions about organization, strategy, and tactics that have to take place. Because this is what always happens, right? It's the expedient response to the immediate issue in front of us. And then it feels like the next step to stop having to respond to every single issue means we got to get the Democrat in. So you already know that more likely than not, they're going to get the House. So they're going to have the three wings of government for the first 2 years of the Trump administration. The pressure to stop every single thing anyone is doing to win back the House in 2026 is just going to be unbelievable. And this is what happens. And then 2026 comes. And then we know if Trump's not dead, that there'll be some Republican knuckle dragger who will be the worst thing that we've ever heard of, which means all hands on deck. Everything must end now to get Josh Shapiro or some other hack from the Democratic Party into office. And so we know that's the cycle. And everything that we do then gets put on hold forever, because there's never a good time when the Republicans are always lurking, in the shadows. There's never a good time to do the work that we need to do. So this is part of the political challenge. These are the discussions that we have to be having now. How do we build these organizations? And how do we continue to engage with these conversations while having to attend to the inevitable crises that are unleashed by whatever Trump, Bannon, Stephen Miller have in store for us?
Well, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is the co-founder of Hammer and Hope, a digital magazine of race, culture, and politics. She's the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation and a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the class struggle created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Fiorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio, and find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling other people to check out this podcast, IRL, online, however. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this podcast up and going strong. Even a few bucks is huge.